Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which is science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. Thank you all of you for joining our courses, 12x Debunking Mythology course and 12x Yoga Teachers course, which have become very popular. And over the 2 years, 3 years, a lot of students have passed out of those certificate courses. And also, thank you for getting my books. You've made me Amazon bestseller. This is the third year in the row for all my 12 books. I have a very, very special guest. I have been talking to him personally, and he's a host of a very popular show across the world. And you must have seen me sometimes coming on his channel in the USA. It's called Jaipur Dialogues USA. And recently he hosted a huge Jaipur Dialogues conference in which is LitFest in India. Some of you were part of it, and you told me all of your experiences also. So, without delay, let us welcome Sri Sanjay Dixit.
Namaste.
Namaste. Welcome to the show, Sanjay ji. So, one of the things which comes to the mind, the topic was, you all know the topic. So, when you host so many well-known people across the world and take their views, and you see how the world sees it, most of the times here we don't get to know all that information because our media is like a black box. What goes in, we don't know.
Okay.
What goes in, we don't know what comes out because it's completely different than what invented. So the processing of our media is extremely good. So they take care of it so much that we hear what they want to tell us. So
Right. Okay.
So, what do you see from the American perspective and India perspective? What is the state of America? How does the world look at America today? As
Well, it depends on which part of the world you're residing. If you're probably in Europe or what is called the developed world, then maybe you'll have a very benign view of America. And if you're probably in the Islamic world, then you look at America as the big Satan, as Osama bin Laden would have said. And even though most of the regimes do not approve of what Osama bin Laden had said publicly, but the Islamic world does view America as the big Satan. And these days, you have organizations, Muslim organizations, Islamic organizations, even within the United States, saying this openly. But then, if you protest it, because right now in America, free speech is what we call it's kind of Orwellian lingo. Okay, so tailored speech is free speech, just as they used to say slavery is freedom, ignorance is knowledge, and war is peace. Remember George Orwell, 1984. I'm talking about. So George Orwell was supposed to come true in the Marxist regime of the USSR. In fact, it was written on that basis, and China. But unfortunately, it seems to have come true in the United States, where the academic spaces have mostly been taken over by people who talk about free speech and practice exactly the reverse or exactly the opposite. So that's how you will look at United States in the Islamic world. Now, coming to the third world, well, they are quite starry-eyed, especially in really undeveloped countries. They are quite starry-eyed about the United States, and most of them have been sufferers of colonization. The colonization pattern has been such that actually America is today the extension of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. So, what used to be the British Empire in the 19th century and early 20th century is now called Pax Americana. As far as India is concerned, India now has a very nuanced view of the United States. And those nuanced positions have been conveyed to the Americans within America, sitting on American think tanks within Europe by our foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. And that nuanced position is that we do not buy every narrative that you seek to burden us with. So I think that's how the world in general looks at America.
No, particularly after the the conflict in Ukraine and the American freezing of Russian dollar deposits in American system or SWIFT system. I think the world has it was a shock to the world. And do you think that that also accentuated people to take hardline positions or see American FDI, like investing in USA? Even today, the USA is the number one recipient of FDI. So, as a risk, sometimes you think that way?
Yes, it is. It is a terrible risk. In fact, the Russians have played it very well. If you'd seen the collapse of the Russian ruble initially, you remember the Russian ruble was about 78 when the Ukrainian war started. And it went down to about 140 within a fortnight or about 20 days of the war. And after that, they did something which was unheard of, and they said that uh, they will sell all their commodities. And Europe, is heavily dependent on Russian commodities. Even the world is heavily dependent on commodities coming out of Russia. And said so they used the power of their commodities, and they said that you have to buy everything in ruble. And the ruble, it went to 54. I think today it is trading around 60. So they made absolute nonsense of this currency coercion that the Americans practiced. You see, diplomacy has, I think, according to me, there are three basic components of diplomacy. And it is discussion, exchange of ideas, it is persuasion. Every country has its own sphere of interest, it has its own national interests, and basically, international relations is balancing of these competing national interests. And the third component of this is coercion. Now, this coercion was practiced through 16th to early 20th century through colonization. And colonization is a black chapter in Indian history and also in several parts of the world. Then, when this coercion became untenable in the sense that direct physical coercion became difficult, then other forms of coercion have been devised. And one of them is this sanction diplomacy. Now, this sanction diplomacy has become so pronounced and so much in your face, quote unquote, that it seems to have become counterproductive now. And if it is not exactly counterproductive today, it is going to become counterproductive in the future. And one thing that it has successfully done is that it has finally buried the concept of globalization. Whatever globalization was brought in, it was basically to suit the needs of the Western world. The WTO, when it was brought in at that time, most people did not have a great idea about how it was going to work. In fact, if today you were to renegotiate, if you were to say that, okay, the old WTO is cancelled and we will negotiate a WTO afresh, then you will find that no country, I can guarantee you, no country is going to sign on a new WTO. Such has been the experience of the developing world because they found that this whole WTO regime was so much inclined and so much biased towards the interests of the Western and the developed world that it wasn't helping them at all. And with the Ukraine war and with, I should say, some uh, really poor diplomacy on part of the Western countries, they have managed to create a permanent wedge between the interests of the Western world, or what we call the developed world, and the rest. And fortunately or unfortunately, the rest comprises more than 60% of the world's population, including the two biggest ones, China and India. Yeah.
You mentioned the term colonization, and I did one of my books was Gold, Glory, and God. I think it's very popular in the US now. In that, I mentioned one of the lines was colonization never ended, and by United Nations, and you mentioned WTO, which is a very important, which you correctly said it very well, and also other forums like IMF, the World Bank, which made a very pro-Western models and supported by the militaries. Because why will a European navy be working in Indian Ocean backyard? Diego Garcia. Why? It's an open world. India is an ally. So why will they be still there? So there is some hammer there. So according to you, so do you think colonization never ended? It was just replaced with a new form of colonization.
You see, the physical colonization, I make a differentiation. You can say now this has also become the current language. And in the current lingo, you differentiate between colonization and coloniality. Colonization, you can call the physical part of the colonization is the colonization where there was physical occupation of certain territories, certain countries, and that physical part of the colonization ended. And it also ended because after the Second World War, Europe had lost its capacity to govern them, and also because the New World Order that America wanted to bring in, they found that they were not the real beneficiary of colonization. That certain countries that were benefiting from those physical colonization, that they needed to be weaned off this physical occupation in order to serve American interests. And so the physical occupation was ended, but then coloniality, that means the features or the motivations that actually brought in colonizations, those features were, I should say, morphed, and then they were fed into a world in a way that everybody came to believe that that was probably the only way that the world could be saved. And it was a continuation of, we call sometimes, mental colonization. So the coloniality, the systems of coloniality have continued. Not only have they continued, they have also been reflected. You remember, the Western world, they wanted to have some kind of very, very uniform, universal, Eurocentric model. That Eurocentric model, if you remember, there was this, I think, this paper by the United Nations that said that if the undeveloped world or the developing world has to develop, then it has to make sacrifices. Now, what were those sacrifices? Those basically entailed the sacrifice of their culture, sacrifice of their way of living, sacrifice of their, I should say, ancient sciences. That was something that was demanded of India too. And unfortunately, we had a weak leadership at that time that meekly surrendered to that kind of an idea. And that is how you had either Western capitalism or the Soviet brand of socialism, all Western concepts. But that seems to have passed now. And the United Nations itself, I think in their millennial goals, they themselves acknowledge this, and they said that, okay, you need to develop along with the basic culture of that country. You cannot grow in opposition to the culture of a country. So that at least has now been acknowledged after some 70 years were wasted in useless experimentation, bringing tremendous woe, tremendous sadness, tremendous hardships to a lot of the developing world. Now, we have to see that this millennial goal rooted in one's country's culture is carried forward. India is probably in the forefront of it, and it has been articulated beautifully a number of times by our very capable foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. I think Jaishankar doctrine is the way to go as far as India is concerned, and I'm quite sure the rest of the developing world is watching and they are also going to support this. That simply means that the universal Eurocentric model that was being imposed on the rest of the world is no longer favored and is no longer accepted as what the Western calls gospel truth. And gospel truth basically means unverified truth, which you need to accept without even attempting to verify.
True. I mean, and people who'd like to search is Sjaishankar. You can search on YouTube. You'll see multiple references of his speeches and interviews. So initially, when he spoke on conferences, he was at a conference in the during the Ukraine-Russia initial beginning period. He was in one of the conferences in Europe. I forgot the name of the conference, where he said the Europe has to realize that Europe's problems are not world's problems, and he said a very famous line. And so it was a shock for the Western diplomats that how can India raise their voice? That was the question. Now, after that, after S. Jaishankar, now in the non-aligned movement, also India was the leader. And after that statement, African Union started speaking very openly because they were facing severe food shortages because of the Russian Ukraine, the American sanctions on Russian food. And they also started speaking very openly, which is not being recognized much, that the American sanctions on Russia has actually made the food prices in Africa go up significantly because they were receiving their grains from Russia. So do you think that the India has shown a path again to the rest of the world to speak their mind? And do you think that the American sanctions will next focus on India on some way or the other?
Well, they do try from time to time. They do try in oblique ways, but then they don't have too much of leverage on India because India is not entirely dependent on America. In fact, it is hardly dependent on America as far as the arms are concerned. In fact, if you look at the three major economies that move the world, those are what? Those are the armament industry, those are the pharma industry, and the oil industry. And in all three of them, India is not dependent on the United States at all. In fact, United States has to depend on India to buy their crude in order to manage the trade balance, because the trade balance right now is heavily tilted in favor of India. India has a trade surplus, a large trade surplus with the United States. And during COVID, the monopoly on pharma also went away. And I think Americans, especially the American establishment, the American pharma industry, were greatly miffed by the breakthroughs that India made in developing the vaccine, and some of the Indian vaccines have actually helped the whole world. And the Indian COVID diplomacy was, I think, absolutely brilliant. And that increased India's soft power in a very large number of nations, because India pledged all its surplus supply very openly to the rest of the world, and without overcharging, without profiteering. So the American model has come under a whole lot of strain. And as far as the technology is concerned, the Indian vaccines have done far better. They have been found to be far more efficacious than the costly vaccines that were created in the United States. Per capita deaths in the United States have been 10 times that of India. And look at China. the other competitor. They haven't developed a vaccine. That's why they're still struggling with the COVID, and they don't know what to do with that zero COVID policy that has flattened their economy. So India is not dependent either on armaments, and that is why the Americans, they keep trying, they keep fulminating, but they also need the Indian defense purchases, because if they do not enter into the Indian defense market, then there is France sitting there, there's Germany, they're all competing for the Indian arms market. Pharma, in any case, India is self-sufficient, Atmanirbhar. And in armaments also, it is going to become Atmanirbhar. As far as oil is concerned, it doesn't have to import from America. America asked India to start importing their oil because the trade balance was heavily tilted, as I said, in favor of India. So Americans don't have so much of leverage on India. And if the Americans think that they can do away with the bright students from India, I think that also will work ultimately to India's advantage in the long run. So Americans should get out of this superiority complex, and they should try and collaborate with India and with the rest of the world. The Pax Americana is as good as over, and the Pax Americana has been actually been dismantled by the American overreach in the European theater. Had they not overreached and not actually provoked a confrontation with Russia, then maybe this could have lasted another 10 years. As I see it, the Pax Americana is probably already over.
So one of the interesting things that you mentioned about Pax Americana, and there was a American conference in a couple of 3 4 months back, I think June or July in Los Angeles, which most of the South American countries avoided. Many of the leaders did not come, and the it's very interesting to see that the Canada is a developed country, while Mexico, the largest trading partner of USA, is Mexico. The $530 billion worth of trade annual trade they have is considered a third world country. And any country south of Mexico gets poorer, 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 like until you reach Brazil. And south of Brazil is partly there is a prosperity in one country which is called Chile. So, from your perspective, what are the reasons that the countries north of USA, which are American allies or maybe so-called the British colonies like Canada, and they are rich and the South American countries are poor? What is, according to you, what do you think on that?
See, there are historical reasons for that. If you look at American prosperity, let's examine American prosperity, Canadian prosperity. Where does it come from? A lot of it has come from slave trade. That's an ugly truth that America and Canada don't want to talk about. And a whole lot of it has come from imposing mercantile restrictions on other countries and sucking out resources. What is America? What is United States of America? It is an occupation of a native land. Where are those natives? They were killed off. That is the ugly history of the United States of America, which nobody talks about. Look at a lot of other Western world. Canada, that school scandal was caught only recently. This is how barbaric they have been in subjugating and changing the ways and the culture of the native people. They have done what is called for almost 200 years. They have had skewed trade practices in their favor. And WTO was another example of continuing those skewed trade practices. But I think this Ukraine war has actually been a godsend in the sense that people have realized that, okay, the Pax Americana is finally wilting away. And they have to thank Russia for actually taking the bull by the horn.
You mentioned the word leverages before, and I've heard you speaking a lot on leverages. and the leverage is being used extensively to force many countries to do that. And you correctly said that the if had this Russia would not have taken over, then rest of the world would not be so openly speaking about these issues openly now. But what do you think about the Biden administration's response? And I am not political. Sathology is not a political show. I'll put a disclaimer right there. We are learning because Sanjay ji is a well-known journalist as well as an author of multiple books. So, what do you think the American uh, response is being seen to the world? Is it a knee-jerk reaction, or what do you think?
It is a confused response, more in the nature of knee-jerk reaction. That's what I would say.
So now, if we look at the corrective policy, you mentioned.
I can just elaborate. For
Sure.
instance, they are trying to use Pakistan again, but they forget that today's Pakistan is such a gone case that no matter what they do, they would not be able to revive Pakistan's economy, because Pakistan has put ideology before economy. So the ideology takes the front seat as far as Pakistan is concerned. So whatever you may do, you cannot revive its economy. And they gave a bloody nose to the Americans when they made them run away from Afghanistan. But now Afghanistan itself has turned against Pakistan. So that itself shows that the American policies are actually in the global sphere are basically disastrous, because they cannot withstand any kind of domestic pressure. A lot of American foreign policy is dependent on midterm elections or presidential elections and what have you. And Vietnam War, according to me, was not lost by the American military. Vietnam War was lost due to American domestic politics. Afghanistan war was lost because of American domestic politics. And the Democrats itself, I think I can see going forward a clash within the Democrats between their moderate and the extremist sections. And the way the Democrats have been trying to appease the more extremist sections of their own party, Bernie Sanders, etc., I think the Americans may be moving so much into the socialistic policies that they might actually harm their USP. And that USP, what we call free speech, free markets, free movement, all of that is actually under threat. You are living in the United States, and I think you should know that better than I do. And those domestic policies impacting international policy is a pretty bad idea and has been afflicting USA for a long time. And what we call the famous USA establishment that actually uh, leans very heavily on this pharma, armament, and oil industry is now losing out internationally because they provoked this unnecessary war. They didn't have to cross those red lines which Russia had drawn. Russia was fairly content. In fact, you remember it has been a story of perfidy against the Russians. The Russians dismantled the USSR on certain set of promises made by the West, and they went right back on it. Not just they went right back on it, they actually tried to profit from Russia. They put up their puppet like Boris Yeltsin. After Putin has come in, they find that Putin is actually safeguarding his own country's interest rather than safeguarding West's interest. This is what Dr. S. Jaishankar also says when somebody was asking him that, how do you step up to the West? And he said, I don't have to step up to the West. I am not here to guard West's interests. I am here to guard India's interests. So I will step up to my own interests. And if India's interest tomorrow is served by allying with China, then so be it. We are not in some kind of a hypothetical situation. If our interest is served by allying with Russia, because Russia is India's best bet in preventing any kind of coercive sanctions coming from the West, because we know that the West is very heavily cut up in India's independence stand on Ukraine. And so who is going to assist India in the United Nations tomorrow if the West decides the United Nations leads that United States leads a chorus to put sanctions on India? It will be Russia. It will be probably France also, because France is also carrying out a more independent policy, unlike UK, which is almost an appendage of the United States. So it is very, very critical for India to engage with Russia, not necessarily be an ally. It isn't exactly an ally, but India is looking for, or as far as the global positioning is concerned, India wants a multipolar world. Both US and China. China wants a two-polar world. The United States is still living that dream of having a unipolar world. So that is where the basic confrontation or the basic divergence of interests lie.
You spoke about world order, and India wants a multipolar world, and which I think the world also wants a multipolar world, because like you said, globalization is dead and localization is in, where every country has their inherent strengths. Now, the world view, which is a Western worldview, which profits the West and centered around Europe. Now, the definition of West also needs to be clarified, that what do you mean by West? And also the international world order. So there are two different words being spoken about. And there is a World Economic Forum which is also working on a real world order, different world order. So do you think which world order will survive in this scenario?
See, when we say international world order, it is basically US-led international order, and its defining feature are the Bretton Woods institutions. That's what we understand by the international world order, which also euphemistically it is called the rules-based order. It's already been challenged by China. The international order being able to do nothing about it. If you remember, the dispute between the Philippines and the China, and there was an arbitration. That arbitration award went in favor of the Philippines, and the Philippines has not been able to enforce it in the South China Sea. South China Sea dispute I'm talking about, the maritime dispute over the artificial islands. Philippines has actually won it. It's won the international arbitration, but they can't enforce it. So China has been cocking a snook at the international world order. Then the US has not been able to enforce it. And US itself, in fact, is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Laws of the Seas. And then it is not able to also support the countries. In fact, it's not able to support Ukraine in a very big way. And Ukraine has been completely decimated because it chose to ally with the West. So there lies a lesson for many of the poorer countries, or many of the lesser countries. Ukraine is not exactly a poor country. Many of the lesser countries. In fact, Ukraine is by territory the largest European country, other than Russia. And the way the West, that is the US-led developed world, has thrown Ukraine into the fire and into the, I should say, into a self-destructive mechanism or the self-destruct path. That carries a lesson for everybody who wants to be an ally with the USA. I remember it was Henry Kissinger who said, and I think that about sums up how the Western Eurocentric, US-centric world works for the lesser countries. He said that it is dangerous to be enemies with the United States. Okay, I'm repeating it. It is dangerous to be enemies with the United States, but it is absolutely fatal to be its friend.
You quoted Henry Kissinger, which most of the students will love it, but most of the other side of the world won't run it in the US. Now, coming back, you said many, many important things here, many important. I've been noting down. One question which has come from the audience right now is that the the Indian strong position or stable position, that's not strong, a stable, the question is stable position of India as far as neutrality is considered is it happened with Switzerland, it happened with many other countries which have emerged prosperous after taking neutral positions, much more prosperous and much more secure also. So India's neutral position, being an ally of the US, is it working against the US interest or it's working for Russian interest?
Well, the official term that the United States uses for India is not an ally. It uses the term partner. And it also uses the same term for Pakistan. And then US nuances it by saying that India is our global partner, Pakistan is our regional partner. So India also says the same thing, that okay, US is our global partner and Russia is our old trusted friend. So where is the dichotomy? And India, I must say, India is not exercising neutrality. India is exercising multipolarity. There is a difference between the two. India is not a neutral nation. It is engaged with everyone.
So as soon as the Democrats took over and the 2 years back, the old world politics, the American administration went back to the old ways of equating Pakistan and India. And Pakistan economy is smaller than the economy of Mumbai today. Just the Mumbai city is a bigger economy than Pakistan, entire Pakistan. So the I would call it the foolishness of American policymakers and also think tanks sitting in DC, because most of the think tanks in DC are run by 23-year-old kids. In fact, the one of the people who runs the in Pakistan or India policy is a hardly 30-year-old guy. So the point is how much importance, and India doesn't have an American ambassador yet. So which also shows a little bit that how much importance which Americans are giving to India. Why do you think this is the current policy of Americans from your point of view?
Well, as far as the ambassador point is concerned, I think they named an ambassador whom India did not want, and that probably is the reason for the standoff. So it isn't exactly that America is ignoring India. America, as I said, as I already told you, America is in no position to ignore India. That is why it keeps engaging in Quad. But in Quad, they want India to run their gauntlet. They want to fire off the shoulders of India, but India will not let that happen. In fact, there was a question asked on Quad to Dr. Jayashankar, who said, well, if the Quad nations expect us to respect their national interest, then I must tell you that some of them do not even honor our maps with respect to Pakistan and China. So therein lies the rub. We are not allies, we are partners, and we partner with everybody. And this old policy of coercion, part of the diplomacy, is no longer going to work. You can have discussions, you can have trade-offs, you can have negotiations, you can have persuasions, you cannot have coercions with India.
One interesting thing comes in is the name Victoria Nuland, who used to be working for CIA and was responsible for balkanization. and she toured India and extensively, and it was very negatively viewed by Indian Americans, number one, and also Indians also generally. So, given her background, and she met the kind of people she met in India and kind of things she was doing, like, do those kind of emissaries by the American government help in fostering relationship with India?
They're absolutely counterproductive. Everybody knows about Victoria Newland. Not just Victoria Newland, there's several other things, several, uh, I should say, several branches of US establishment in the media who are actively engaged in vilifying India and vilifying Hindus. We all know about it. And it's not the 70s. The US must realize that. Even in the 70s, Indira Gandhi did not listen to US and she vivisected Pakistan.
Yes, and I think one of the speeches of Indira Gandhi's welcoming address at by Ronald Reagan is a very famous reminder when she said, "We are old civilization and you are a new one." She said that very clearly in that opening remarks. One last question, which has come from the audience, is that will India be ever willing to put boots on the ground in any of the conflict areas where they want Americans to get involved?
Why should we want Americans to get involved? We don't want Americans to get involved anywhere. We are fully capable of doing our own thing. If at all we need, maybe we'll buy a few weapons from them. And we know that America is an unreliable partner. That's why we are very careful in buying crucial weaponry from them also, because we don't know when they will put a squeeze on spare parts and such things. Russia has always been our reliable and trusted partner. That is why, as far as India is concerned, or the Indians are concerned, the real patriotic Indians are concerned, we are always wary of United States. And we don't want to get involved anywhere where America is involved. And we don't need America to get their troops into India. We know that the Americans, especially the American public, has a very low tolerance level as far as battle casualties are concerned. They do not have the fortitude and the resolve and the deep societal commitments to battle casualties that Indians have. And that is why Americans have been losing wars everywhere. We do not want a particular body of troops or a particular army which has such low tolerance of casualties. We don't want Americans troops anywhere near our areas of concern. We are fully capable of dealing it with ourselves. Indian troops are the best in the world. Everybody knows that. That is why they were drafted into the Second World War, and they were instrumental in the Britain and the Allied powers winning the Second World War.
Also, the First World War, because the Indian
Also, the
troops
First World War. Yes.
Indian troops destroyed captured the Turkish. Actually, the question I'll
The
clarify the question.
American public, let me address it to the American public, because the Americans are listening. They cannot take battle casualties. They start hounding their leaders. The moment 10 troops die, Indians have a civilizational time cycle that goes into billions of years. And that is why we have tremendous fortitude and tremendous capacity to take these losses. Because we go by the lessons of the Bhagavad Gita that says that the life on this planet is a transient life. It is just a transition. It is because of that you can never match the mindset of an Indian soldier. American soldiers can never match the mindset of an Indian soldier. Western soldiers can never match that. Islamic soldiers, some of them, because they have this great fondness for their mythical Jannat, they might sometimes be able to do better. In fact, they do better than the Western soldiers all the time. And secular armies, forget it. You have to be rooted in some kind of a faith to be able to fight when bullets are flying all around. If you do not have a faith, you cannot fight. So the Western world, which is becoming what is called no religion, no spirituality, is not going to be able to fight any war 15, 20, 30 years from now.
Yudhya Palayana, very famous words of Bhagavad Gita. So the context I was trying to say, the context in which that question was asked was when the American troops get involved, other than India, like in Afghanistan or other countries of conflict. That was the context of the question. Whether the
No, Indians will not get involved into other people's affair. No way.
That was the context. Thank you so much, Sanjay ji, for coming on the show. And do you want to conclude anything? Would like to, if I missed out any point on this topic?
No, I think you covered most of it, and I have to thank you, and I have to thank the audience also for being very patient with me. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sanjay Dixit ji, for coming on the show. And people do go to his channel, Jaipur Dialogues, a very famous channel on YouTube, and subscribe to that channel and hear what he says on different topics, international as well as and there is a Jaipur Dialogues USA also. And also, he has written famous books on Yogeshwar. You can search his name on Amazon. You can get his books in the US. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Sanjay ji. And do like, share, and subscribe to our channel and let us know your feedback. Namaste.
Namaste.